My new alien pet cat was on top of me when I woke up. Her reason left me speechless. Dane's eyes fluttered open to the unsettling pressure of weight against his chest, something warm and living pressing him into the cot's worn padding. For a breathless moment, he lay absolutely still, listening to his own heartbeat thud in his ears. The dim overhead lights of his cramped bunk in the aging freighter flickered ominously, casting shifting shadows across the metal walls. A subtle vibration from the ship's engines rumbled beneath him, and he felt each pulse of it through his tense muscles. Then a tail, no, not quite a tail, more like a long, sinuous limb, shifted against his ribs, and he realized he couldn't delay confronting this bizarre situation any longer. A low sound filled the small space, a purr that was strangely resonant, alive with an undercurrent of menace. He lifted his head just slightly, only to see a pair of gleaming golden eyes stare back. They were set in a face so alien, yet disturbingly captivating that he froze, adrenaline tearing through his bloodstream. Her emerald skin, accentuated by dark, swirling tattoos along her arms and shoulders, practically glowed in the dimness. She wore minimal clothing, tattered scraps of light fabric across her lower half, and what might be called a bra of delicate alien design. Her hair hung in an obsidian sheet that framed her high cheekbones, and those pointed feline ears twitched, once catching the sound of his breath hitching. Her lips curved into a faint mocking smile, as if she knew exactly what was going through his mind. "If you don't move," she murmured, her voice a sultry vibration that curled through the "I might assume you want me to stay." She didn't sound flirtatious or gentle. It was a clear verbal taunt, delivered as calmly as if she had every right to lounge upon him. Dine's body tensed. He refused to give her the satisfaction of an immediate reaction. Instead, he swallowed once, forced his muscles to respond, and shoved upward. She moved with a lithe grace that kept her balanced atop him for one more elongated moment, until finally, with a low growl, she slid off, letting him scramble upright. The cot's frame squeaked in protest. Dine pressed his back against the wall, ignoring the sudden sting in his shoulder, and leveled a steely gaze at her. In the flickering light, she looked more demon than cat, definitely not the timid creature he'd expected after hearing rumors of her captivity. She rose onto her knees, adjusting the draping cloth around her hips with an unhurried air of defiance. He said nothing as he pushed himself to his feet, tasting metal in the back of his mouth as his jaw tightened. The so-called pet cat he'd been told to keep locked in the cargo hold was nothing of the sort. This was a lethal predator masquerading in a half-feline, half-woman body, and the fact she'd emerged here in his private quarters spelled a serious oversight on his part. The way she watched him, golden irises glinting with challenge, suggested she was searching for a weakness. He refused to look away, even when her lips parted in that half-smile once more. "You like holding me down, don't you?" she purred. "What a shame you never locked the door properly." He didn't rise to her bait. He turned sharply, hand hovering at his belt where his sidearm should be. It was gone. She pressed one claw-tipped finger to her lips, giving a playful wag of the object he sought. A small blaster glinting in her other hand. Dane's heart thudded heavier in his chest. He wasn't about to let her see any sign of panic, though. He clenched his fists, forcing a smirk to curve his mouth. The one he knew always infuriated those who faced him in a standoff. "That belongs to me," he said, curt and lethal. She tilted her head. "Funny, I don't see your name on it." A sudden, violent tremor ran through the ship, jolting them both. The overhead lights flickered more aggressively, and a distant klaxon started to wail. Dane's smirk vanished. He lunged forward, ignoring the potential danger of her claws, and grabbed for the weapon. She swiped at him, movement lightning fast, but he caught her forearm and twisted, forcing her onto her back. He slammed his free hand down on her wrist to knock the blaster loose. It clattered to the floor and slid under his cot. She hissed, a distinctly animalistic sound, but still radiating an odd elegance, even with her shoulders pressed to the cold metal. "No time for your games," he snapped, and his voice came out harsher than intended. "We're under attack. If you want to survive, you'll stop trying to kill me." She gave a low, resonating laugh, twisting her hips in an attempt to knock him off balance. The friction of her body sliding under his made his pulse spike. He could smell the faint scent of something wild, mixed with the ozone tang of Starship electronics. She arched upward, forcing him to adjust his grip. For a split second, her face hovered inches from his, those golden eyes daring him to look away. Then the ship lurched again, and an explosion rocked the corridor just outside, followed by a shout from a distant part of the vessel. Her laughter died as she flung him off, rolling to her feet with uncanny ease. He grabbed the nearest piece of gear, a short-range baton, and scrambled upright. His broad shoulders bristled with tension, and the bruise along his ribs from a prior mission flared in pain, but he couldn't afford weakness. Storming for the hatch, he glanced back to see her standing there, arms at her sides, as if waiting, for an invitation. It took him a moment to realize she was poised to follow him, not run. He clenched his teeth. If you make me regret letting you out, You'll do what? She cut in, a bite in her voice. Lock me up again. He wrenched open the hatch, ignoring the retort that sprang to his lips. He couldn't deny that she'd stolen any advantage from him the moment she got free. For all he knew, she'd dismantle half his crew if she wanted. The reality, however, was that he needed every able fighter if the ship really was under attack. With another shuddering impact, the floor lurched, forcing him to brace against the doorway. Smoke wafted through the corridor. The emergency lights glowed dull red, casting an eerie hue over everything. She stepped out behind him, tension radiating from her frame, those feline ears pivoting to catch distant sounds of conflict. He forced himself to move quickly. Crew members rushed by, some shouting about hull breaches, others brandishing weapons. He recognized the ringleader of his salvage team, a burly ex-merc named Eros, who nearly took a shot at Zira before Dane barked an order to stand down. He had no time to explain the situation, no desire to recount how this alien woman ended up in his quarters, or why he was protecting her from friendly fire. A violent jolt shuddered through the ship again, and he heard a voice crackle over the "Commander Dane, we've got 2 fighters latching onto the cargo bay. Looks like they're trying to board." The transmission fizzled, but the urgency was clear. Dane turned to Zira, about to bark instructions, and he saw her nostrils flare, as though she scented something in the air. "They're close," she said flatly in that thrumming voice of hers. "I can smell them." Dane snorted, rushing down the corridor. "Let's hope you're as good at fighting as you think you are." She needed no encouragement. As they reached the main hold, she darted forward, bounding across debris-strewn floors with a speed that made even Dane's carefully honed reflexes look sluggish. The cargo bay doors blasted open in a spray of sparks, and an armed boarding party in tattered uniforms poured through the breach. Gunfire echoed through the cramped metal space. He returned fire, hearing the static-laden thunder of weapons. Zira launched into the fray with a savage grace, her body twisting to avoid projectiles, her claws lashing out. One enemy toppled backward, blood arcing across the deck as she struck. Dane was no stranger to brutality, but seeing it unleashed by this alien, someone rumored to be a docile pet, reminded him how foolish rumors could be. She was not docile, not even close. She was unstoppable, weaving and pouncing as though this were a choreographed dance. That near-feral purr escaped her lips again, but now it was layered with a lethal undertone. Watching her, Dane found himself strangely transfixed for a split second, so much so that a boarding soldier nearly shot him in the back. At the last moment, Dane dove, rolled behind a crate, and returned fire, searing a hole through the man's chest armor. The firefight was short but intense. Smoke coiled in the air. The boarding party was either dead or retreating, and a sudden hush fell upon the bay, save for the drone of the ship's engines and the hiss of venting steam from damaged pipes. Zira strode through the wreckage, stepping over corpses with eerie composure, her eyes surveying the carnage. When she locked her gaze on him again, she gave a faint, savage grin, and for a moment he felt an uncomfortable heat in his chest. He stomped toward her, ignoring the debris. "Don't get cocky," he snapped. "More will come." She raised a brow. "I'm counting on it." He forced down any hint of respect he felt at her combat prowess. She was dangerous, maybe more than any threat outside these walls. Still, he needed her. This was bigger than pride. So with a curt nod, he signaled her to follow. Together they raced deeper into the ship, where more crew members were huddled or preparing to repel additional boarders. The entire place smelled of melted metal and the acrid tang of gunpowder. Alarms blared from all directions, the ship's AI intoning warnings about hull integrity. In the chaos, Dane snapped out orders, though people kept glancing with barely concealed shock at the emerald-skinned woman prowling behind him. He found a moment to catch his breath by the main console, wiping sweat and grime from his face. Zyra lingered near him, her posture reading bored impatience, but he could sense she was on high alert. Her ears flicked, scanning for the faintest sound, and her tattoos seemed to glisten as if charged by adrenaline. She cocked her head, those golden eyes flicking from readout to readout on the console's cracked screen. "Trouble?" she purred. "Or are you just stalling?" He glared. "I'm plotting our next move," he said, ignoring the urge to snap back in anger. Then a beep from the console drew his attention. A sensor reading indicated a pair of frigates in the sector, each heavily armed. This wasn't just a random raid. Somebody powerful wanted what he was carrying, or who he was carrying. Zyra leaned closer, close enough that he caught the faint exotic scent of her hair, an aroma like night-blooming flowers. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "Who did you cross, human?" He flicked a glance at her, pressing a few buttons. "Someone more interested in you than me." He decided not to mention that these attacks started right after he accepted the job to transport a rarity. He'd been told it was a cat-like alien, docile enough to handle. They'd lied, or they hadn't known the full truth. "You have a lot of enemies," he added. She shrugged, almost amused. "I have admirers," she corrected, "who think they can claim me." The ship rocked again, and he saw the flashing icon indicating a second boarding party had latched onto a different section. He gestured for Zyra to follow him down the corridor, waving a few of his men to secure the immediate area. She slunk after him, her silent footfalls on the metal deck plating a testament to her predatory nature. He tried to ignore the subtle tension in his gut every time she got too close. They weren't allies, they weren't even friends. Necessity alone bound them together. As they hurried around a corner, the corridor lights flickered ominously, threatening to plunge the passage into darkness. The heavy door at the far end was jammed half open. Smoke billowed, and beyond the thick haze, Dane heard boots clanging, on the deck. He raised his baton, cursing under his breath for having lost his blaster. Zyra, though unarmed except for her claws, exuded a lethal calm. They burst through the door into a swirl of gunfire. Ducking low, Dane beckoned her to split to the side, but Zyra, with a hiss of frustration, lunged forward, flanking the intruders. He followed suit, adrenaline pumping. The intruders fired blindly, bullets ricocheting off the walls. One round grazed Dane's arm, burning a neat hole through his sleeve. He gritted his teeth, returning fire with a salvaged pistol from a fallen enemy. Each shot reverberated in the enclosed space, setting his ears ringing. From the corner of his eye, he saw Zyra leap onto a cargo container, using it as a springboard to tackle an armed soldier. Her claws flashed in the red emergency light, and the soldier toppled with a choking gurgle. Another intruder rushed her from behind, brandishing a knife, but Dane managed a single, well-placed shot that took the enemy down. She glanced at him, eyes feral, chest heaving. He couldn't read her expression. Was it gratitude, challenge, or something else entirely? By the time the dust settled, they stood among battered cargo boxes and scattered bodies. Dane's men arrived a moment later, securing the hatch. He quickly assessed the damage. The hull was compromised in 3 places, but for now, the ship still limped along. Zyra hopped down from her vantage point, landing without a sound. She rolled her shoulders and walked toward him. Blood spattered across her midriff. "Impressive," she said in a clipped tone, as though awarding him faint praise. "You're not dead yet," he snorted, pressing a hand to the wound on his arm. "Maybe you want me alive," he said wryly. Her lips parted in a silent laugh, exposing sharp canines. Then, as the alarms continued to shriek, they heard a groan from one of the injured intruders. Dane approached the man, who was pinned under a fallen crate, half delirious from pain. Before the man could speak, Zyra crouched and grabbed his collar, hoisting him with effortless strength. "You came for me," she said, voice cold, vibrating with that latent power. "Who sent you?" The man's eyes darted around in panic. Dane crouched, his brow furrowed. He wanted answers just as badly. For a few seconds, The intruder opened and closed his mouth, refusing to speak. Then the ship's deck rumbled again. Debris falling. Time was short. Zira's claws extended, pressing against the soldier's throat, drawing a rivulet of blood. "I'd talk," Dane said quietly, noticing the fear in the soldier's gaze. "Don't kill me," the man rasped. It's Rathon Consortium. They've got a bounty on her, big money, didn't know she'd be traveling with a crew that actually fights back." He coughed, blood trickling down his lip. "We were told it'd be easy. We didn't sign." "Up for this slaughter." Zira's lips twisted, something close to disgust. "You put a price on me like I'm a trophy? Your boss must be a fool." The soldier didn't answer, fading fast. Dain rose. The Rathon Consortium was a known power-hungry faction, known for collecting unique biospecimens for twisted experiments. It explained why Zira was in such high demand. He flicked his gaze to her. She released the man, who sagged into unconsciousness. Silence hung between them, broken only by the buzz of the battered lights. Finally, Dane gestured for his men to deal with the prisoner. Secure him, patch his wounds. He might be useful later. They saluted and hurried to comply. Zira stood there, arms folded, breathing slowly, returning to normal. Her eyes met his. "You didn't know you were ferrying me to a bunch of psychopaths, did you?" she asked, subdued. He shook his head. "No. I was told you were contraband, a valuable commodity, but not this." He let out a breath, scanning her form. "If I'd known, I wouldn't have taken the job. They said you were just some exotic pet. I never believed them, but I didn't expect you to be deadly," she supplied, raising a brow. He didn't deny it. "Capable." Her posture remained stiff, as though she expected betrayal at any second. She had every right. People had put her in chains, used her like currency. He couldn't blame her for having a chip on her shoulder. Still, they had a bigger problem. The Rathon Consortium wasn't going to give up. If he tried to hand her over, he'd lose whatever shred of honor he had left. If he refused, he'd be on the run. The notion of being a target didn't frighten him, though. He was accustomed to living in the crosshairs. He glanced around, seeing the battered remains of his crew patching wounds, clearing bodies. They were loyal to him, but loyalty only stretched so far when entire corporations set bounties. He needed a plan. Zira was watching him carefully, measuring his reactions. Something in her gaze told him she wouldn't be easy to shake. At last, he straightened, approached her cautiously. "I can't keep you locked up," he said quietly. "Not that I ever could." A faint smirk touched his lips. "But if you want off this ship, you might not survive on your own. They'll be hunting you. If we reach neutral space, or one of the outer colonies, you might stand a chance." She eyed him, the tension in her shoulders never quite leaving. "So you want to help me escape them, is that it?" He shrugged. "I'll help myself too. I'm not interested in tangling with the consortium any longer than necessary. But if you stick around, it's going to be a fight. We can't just vanish. We need to blast our way through." A flicker of something, respect or amusement, crossed her features. "I prefer fights to hiding." For a moment, neither spoke. Then the overhead comm crackled with the pilot's frantic voice. "Dane, the jump drive's offline. We're locked out of the nav controls. We can't make a hyperspace jump, and we've got more bogies inbound. Orders?" Dane closed his eyes briefly, frustration welling up. Another standoff, another battle. He fixed Zira with a hard look. "Welcome to the partnership you never asked for. We survive together or not. At all." She blinked slowly, that purr building in the back of her throat. It wasn't entirely threatening now, maybe a twisted sign of acceptance. "I'll follow you," she said, "but don't assume I'm tamed." "Never," he replied, stepping aside to let her pass. Though she was lethal, he couldn't deny the subtle magnetism in each movement of hers. Even with bloodstains on her emerald skin, she looked like a living embodiment of danger, a force of nature that had chosen, for the moment, to stand at his side. They moved through the corridors to the engineering bay, where sparks flew from. Half a dozen damaged panels. Crew members knelt among scattered tools, trying to jury-rig a solution. The jump drive needed a reboot, but someone, likely from the boarding party, had sabotaged the primary controls. Zira paced restlessly behind him while he barked instructions to a technician. Every so often he'd sense her presence at his shoulder, that near silent step. It set his nerves on edge in a way that had nothing to do with fear. There was something else, an undercurrent of tension that went beyond their tenuous alliance. He shoved it aside, refusing to acknowledge anything. Deeper, they had a mission: survive. An alarm whooped in the distance, and a readout popped up on the nearest console. The external sensors had detected more incoming hostiles. Dane cursed. "We've got multiple craft inbound, all bearing Rathon Consortium signatures. They're going to tear this ship apart unless we can jump." He half expected Zira to vanish into the shadows, to escape the moment things got too dire. But instead she planted herself by his side, ears pricked forward in alertness. "Then let's not give them the chance," she said. He had to remind himself that her unwavering courage didn't mean she wasn't thinking of her own agenda. For all he knew, she was simply waiting for the moment to use him as a shield. Still, he had to admit he respected her fierceness. The pilot's voice crackled again over the intercom. "Brace for contact, Dane. We'll try to hold them off as long as we can, but I can't promise anything if they send heavy reinforcements." Dane slammed the console with his palm, frustration flaring. "We need that jump drive operational now," he growled at the engineer, who was elbow-deep in sparking wires. The man grimaced, eyes wide with stress. "I'm trying, boss." Another 5 minutes, maybe more. 5 minutes felt like a lifetime in a firefight. Dane turned, and Zira was right there, her presence forcing his heart to pound a little harder than usual. She looked up at him, tilting her head as if hearing something he couldn't. "They've docked," she said, voice tense. "I can sense their footsteps through the hull." He believed her. Her enhancements, whatever they were, gave her an edge. He gestured for her to follow as they darted back into the corridor. The lights flickered ominously, red emergency beacons casting their silhouettes in sharp relief against the bulkheads. They stepped over twisted metal, past men with injuries and frightened eyes. He could feel the fear in the air, a tangible thing pressing on them, yet she seemed only emboldened by it. Another blast shook the ship as a new breach opened. Dane signaled for his men to form up, weapons at the ready. The corridor ahead was dark, power fluctuations leaving it in shadow. He and Zira stood side by side, waiting, listening to the clang of footsteps. Tension gripped him, the same rush he felt in every battle, but now heightened by her presence. She was coiled energy, ready to pounce. Her purr rumbled in the hush, and a trickle of sweat ran down his temple. The first enemy stepped into view, scanning with a flashlight. Dane bit back a curse, lifted his gun and squeezed the trigger. A flash of light, a deafening boom. The intruder went down. Their squad returned fire, muzzle flashes illuminating the corridor in strobe-like bursts. Zira vanished into the darkness, reappearing behind an enemy soldier and raking her claws across body armor, leaving deep grooves. She ducked a wild shot, slammed the soldier's head against the metal wall with a dull crack, then whirled to face the next threat. For Dane, it was chaos. Smoke, heat, the smell of scorched metal. His ears rang, but he fired shot after shot, dropping 2 more adversaries. Bullets hissed past him, ricocheting off the bulkhead. A lucky round caught him in the side, but the armor plating under his jacket took most of the impact. He stumbled, teeth clenched against the pain. Suddenly a soldier lunged for him. They grappled, each vying for the upper hand in the tight corridor. The soldier twisted Dane's wrist, forcing him to drop his gun, and a knife flashed. Before the blade could find its mark, a flash of emerald skin streaked by. Zira grabbed the assailant's arm, her claws digging in. With a snarl, she yanked him away from Dane and struck with lethal precision. The soldier collapsed, choking. Dane breathed heavily, retrieving his weapon. He nodded his thanks, though he said nothing. She simply smirked, glancing over him to ensure he wasn't badly hurt. Another wave of enemy forces advanced, and the corridor erupted again in gunfire. Minutes stretched into an eternity as they fought side by side. Finally, as the carnage slowed, they stood triumphant, chest heaving, the floor slick with debris and the pungent stench of ozone. Dane wiped sweat from his brow, heart pounding like a war drum. Zira was at his shoulder, posture tense but unyielding. They had beaten back another wave, but more were coming. The ship, battered and trembling, couldn't take much more. Dane's mind raced. If the engineer failed to bring the jump drive back online soon, they were doomed. He keyed his communicator. "How much longer?" A crackle. "Almost there," came the reply, voice stressed. "Another minute or two." Behind them, the battered corridor was littered with the wounded, both from his crew and the intruders. A few of Dane's men moved to triage the injuries. Zyra paced among the bodies, her head held high, breathing ragged but resolute. He stepped closer, feeling the swirl of conflicting emotions in his chest. Their alliance was one of survival, yet the intensity of fighting at her side left him strangely exhilarated. Whenever he caught her eye, a subtle heat flared in his gut, one he refused to acknowledge fully. She was an alien, unpredictable, possibly lethal in more ways than one. But necessity pulled them together, that was all. "Come on," he said, voice rough. "We have to get to the bridge." Her only response was a quick nod. Together they hurried through the labyrinth of corridors, passing flickering overhead, lights that revealed the mounting toll of the assault. The hum of the engines was alarmingly erratic, and the structural groans told Dane the ship was on borrowed time. He dreaded each corner, expecting more boarders at every turn. But they reached the bridge without further confrontation, only to find it partially in ruin. Consoles sparked, and the pilot wrestled with controls to maintain some semblance of flight. "You have control?" Dane asked hoarsely. The pilot shook his head. "Barely. That last wave of sabotage knocked out half our steering thrusters. We're dead in space, waiting for the drive to spin up." "Divert all power to the jump drive," Dane ordered, "and patch me into the external sensors." He hurried to a console, grimacing as he typed. Sure enough, multiple enemy ships were converging. The Rathon consortium had brought in bigger guns. He counted at least 2 heavily armed cruisers. They wouldn't just board this time, they'd blow the hull wide open. Zyra eased behind him, peering over his shoulder. He felt an involuntary awareness of her closeness, the subtle shift of her breath. She smelled like smoke and blood, and something distinctly feminine. "Can we fight them off?" she asked. He exhaled slowly. "We won't survive a direct fight. Our only hope is to jump." He glanced up as the pilot shouted, "We're about to power up the drive. Get ready." In the swirl of klaxons and sparks, Dane's gaze fell on Zyra. The next few seconds would decide their fate. She looked back at him, her ears flattened slightly, her tattoo still pulsing with that strange inner energy. For a heartbeat, they shared an unspoken moment of tension. Then the pilot pulled a lever, and the entire vessel rattled so violently Dane almost lost his footing. Light expanded across the viewports, a bright flash as the stars stretched into lines. The battered freighter lurched forward, forging into hyperspace in a swirl of brilliant color. Alarms abruptly cut off, replaced by a tense hush. They had jumped. They'd escaped, at least for now. Shoulders sagging with relief, Dane let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. A few of his crew cheered weakly, others simply collapsed where they stood. Zyra braced herself against the console, blinking as if readjusting to the sudden shift. He turned to her, adrenaline still pounding. Her gaze met his, and there was no denying the fervor in that moment, the relief, the victory, and the unspoken electricity. He almost reached out, but he caught himself, pulling his hand back. She tilted her head, reading him, and again that subtle smirk curved her lips. "We made it," she said, voice subdued, "though that hardly means we're safe." Dane nodded. "No, but it's a start. Let's see where we can land for repairs." The pilot announced a heading for a fringe station, a place with minimal law enforcement and plenty of black market tech. It was the best they could do. Within minutes, the rest of the crew was tending to the wounded and stabilizing the ship's systems for the short jump. Dane tried to ignore the weight of exhaustion dragging at his limbs. He'd been going non-stop, for hours, maybe days. The vendetta that fueled him had led him into countless firefights, but never one quite like this, and never with a partner who set his nerves on fire. When he finally turned to find Zyra again, she was gone. Not vanished entirely. He sensed she was somewhere aboard, but she'd melted into the ship's passages like a ghost. Part of him wanted to track her down, to confirm that she was truly part of the crew's next move. The other part warned him that chasing her might be akin to tempting fate. So he busied himself with coordinating repairs, checking on his men, securing the cargo hold where she'd originally been kept. The notion of returning her to that cage was out of the question, and he found he had no desire to try. Time slipped by as the battered freighter glided through hyperspace. The tension remained thick, the threat of pursuit ever present, but for the moment they were out of immediate danger. Dane caught himself scanning each corridor for a glimpse of emerald, skin or the flick of a feline ear. He told himself it was caution, or maybe it was something else. Eventually he reached the small medbay where injured crew were laid out on cots. He offered a few gruff words of encouragement, though comfort never came naturally to him. The medic gave him a once-over, bandaged the graze on his arm, and he refused any further attention. There were men in worse shape who needed the resources more. Besides, he had too many decisions to make to afford lying still. He spotted a slight movement in the corner of the medbay, by the flickering overhead panel. Alicia stood there, leaning against the wall, watching him. She said nothing, her expression unreadable, yet her presence was a tangible weight in the small room. He strode over, crossing his arms over his broad chest, ignoring the dull ache of bruised ribs. "You vanish fast," he remarked, trying for neutrality. Her gaze slipped over his bandaged arm, then rose to meet his eyes. "Your crew doesn't like me wandering around, but I don't take orders from them." He didn't deny it. "They'll adjust," he said. "We all have to if we're going to make it out alive." She exhaled through her nose, a sound, not quite a sigh. "Why help me?" she asked abruptly. "You could have turned me over to Rathon when things got rough, kept your own hide intact." He considered her question. Pride, perhaps, demanded a different answer. But the truth was that he'd never been one to sell someone out for a paycheck, not since his own betrayal all those years ago. He let silence linger for a moment. "Not really my style," he finally said. She studied him for a long time without speaking. The hum of med equipment and the soft groans of the injured filled the gaps. Then she inclined her head in an almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement, acceptance, or perhaps curiosity. It felt like a minor concession from a predator uncertain of trust, but willing to entertain the possibility. Dine gestured for her to follow him outside, and they stepped into the corridor. The lighting was dim, flickering in places where the power couplings struggled. His boots clanged softly on the metal deck as he led her to a quieter nook near the cargo hold. He pushed open a hatch to reveal a small alcove that had once been used for storage. The overhead lamp buzzed faintly, casting warm light on the battered walls. He motioned for her to step inside. "I figure you need a space," he said. "Somewhere you can be alone, without worrying about half the crew pointing guns at you whenever you step out of the shadows." She tilted her head, scanning the cramped alcove. There wasn't much, just enough room for a small cot, a battered footlocker, and a fold-down seat. She ran her fingers along the cold metal, then turned to face him, expression guarded. "You're giving me my own room?" He rested his hand against the frame of the hatch, shrugging as he tried to appear indifferent. "We're stuck with each other for the moment. If it keeps the peace on board, it's worth it." Her lips curved in that faint feline smile. It wasn't gratitude in a traditional sense, but perhaps as close as she came to it. She stepped closer, the space forcing her to brush past him. For an electric instant, his senses sharpened. Her scent, the glow of her tattoos, the warmth of her body so near. "If you think this will make me trust you," she murmured, voice barely above a whisper, "you're mistaken." He held her gaze, breath a little too shallow. "I don't need your trust. I need your cooperation until we can both get out of this mess." Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more, stepping fully into the alcove. She turned to face him again, and though the tension between them still sizzled, she remained calm. He took that as a sign of acceptance. Without another word, he backed out and let the hatch slide shut, leaving her a measure of privacy. Leaning against the corridor, "Well?" He ran a hand through his dark hair, exhaling a shaky breath. This alien woman was a storm, a chaos that had turned everything on its head. Yet he couldn't regret his decision. He pushed away from the wall, determined to see to the next crisis and the next. There was always another crisis. Maybe that was all his life would ever be. An endless series of battles, each one leading him closer to whatever revenge he craved for his past. But now intertwined with that path was Zira. The question was whether she'd become a weapon in his arsenal or a complication that would destroy him. By the time the ship exited hyperspace near a dingy fringe outpost, repairs had patched. Some of the worst damage. The battered freighter slid toward the station's docking rings under manual control. Dine stood on the bridge, arms folded, while the pilot maneuvered them in. The station was little more than a collection of rundown platforms orbiting a gas giant, but it was out of the consortium's immediate reach, at least for a short while. When they finally docked, the docking clamps rattling against the hull, Dane thanked the pilot and turned to the battered remains of his crew. "We get in, restock, patch the ship properly. The credits might be tight, but salvage what you can. Keep watch for anyone wearing rathon insignia. If we see them, we lock down, understood?" A chorus of nods. Then he glanced around, wondering if Zira would even bother showing herself. But before he could go looking, she was there in the corridor, idly watching the crew bustle past, her eyes fixed on him, waiting. He gestured with a tilt of his head, silently inviting her to walk with him. They entered the station through a narrow docking tube, emerging into a poorly lit, labyrinthine array of corridors. The smell of stale air, spilled chemicals, and unwashed bodies assaulted Dane's senses. He kept his hand near his weapon, and Zira prowled beside him, eyes flicking over each shady figure they passed. Vendors hawked illegal contraband from metal crates, while drifters eyed them suspiciously. It was the perfect place for a quiet repair job and a quick disappearance. Dane led her deeper into the station, occasionally pausing to purchase spare parts from a booth, or to glower at a pickpocket who ventured too close. Zira said little, but her mere presence seemed to part the crowds. Something in her feral grace warned onlookers to keep their distance. Eventually, they reached a cramped workshop where a twitchy mechanic greeted Dane with a half-toothed grin. After some tense bargaining and an exchange of questionable currency, they secured the necessary components for the jump drive. The mechanic promised a private hangar to complete the repairs, one less likely to attract attention. Dane gave a curt nod. This was as good an arrangement as they could hope for. On their way back to the ship, Zira paused before a stall lined with glass tanks. Inside each tank floated a small, quivering blob of something that resembled alien fish. Her face hardened and she turned away swiftly, as though the sight offended her. He almost asked what it was, but thought better of it. She might see pity or curiosity as weakness. They returned to find the pilot already herding the ship into the designated hangar. The station's dingy overhead lights illuminated the battered hull plating. Crew members scurried around, unloading the parts they'd acquired. It would be an all-night job. Dane sighed, rolling the stiffness out of his shoulders. The ache in his side from the bullet bruise hadn't subsided. Every step made him grit his teeth. At the foot of the ramp, he spotted Zira again. She lingered, near a pile of crates, hands on her hips, scanning the hangar for threats. The lines of her body were tense, coiled. He approached, half expecting a sarcastic remark, but she remained silent until he was close enough to hear her quiet intake of breath. "You said Rathon will come," she said, voice low. "They won't stop just because we're hiding here." He nodded. "I know. That's why we fix up, stock supplies, and get out. We'll find somewhere they can't follow. Maybe you have suggestions." She arched a brow, but the glimmer in her golden eyes suggested she was considering. "I know a place in the Outer Rim. It's lawless, but at least it's not under corporate rule. We could vanish there." He gave a half-smile. "Vanishings. Harder than it sounds, but we'll try." They lapsed into an uneasy silence. Workers bustled around them, carting equipment and tools. Sparks flew where welders patched hull breaches. The air smelled of burnt metal and sweat, underscoring the sense of desperation. Yet Dane noticed Zira's gaze drifting over him when she thought he wasn't looking. The awareness of her scrutiny made his skin prickle. He busied himself with the nearest tasks, occasionally sneaking a glance at her. The tension between them simmered, overshadowed by immediate survival needs but never fully quelled. Hour by hour, repairs progressed. Dane's men grumbled, but worked tirelessly to restore minimal hyperdrive function. Zira vanished for stretches, exploring the station or simply avoiding the throng. He found her once perched on a high catwalk in the hangar, gazing down at the battered ship. She looked almost regal, her dark hair framing her face, emerald skin catching the station's fluorescent glare. When he caught her eye, she merely turned away, continuing her silent vigil. By the time the patch job was nearly done, Dane felt half dead from fatigue. He collapsed onto a makeshift seat by some crates, letting his head fall back. The overhead lights glowed in flickering intervals, reminding him of the war zone that had become his existence. He closed his eyes just for a second, trying to snatch a moment's rest. But the faint click of claws on the metal deck snapped him awake. Zira stood before him, arms folded, tail, if it could be called that, twitching behind her. Her posture was guarded, but for once her expression wasn't mocking. "You look terrible," she remarked. He snorted softly. "Thanks." She dropped to a crouch so their eyes were level, resting her forearms on her thighs. "You should sleep," she said. "I can keep watch." The offer surprised him. He wanted to question her motives, to assume it was a trap. But exhaustion was a powerful equalizer. He gave a short nod, letting his eyes drift shut again. He could feel her presence, hear the distant clang of metal as the crew worked. Strangely, with her there, he felt safer than he would have expected. He couldn't recall the last time he'd trusted anyone enough to close his eyes in their proximity. Yet here he was. He managed a few minutes of fitful rest before the sound of raised voices startled him. The pilot and a station official were arguing near the docking ramp about docking fees. Rubbing a hand over his face, Dane pushed himself upright. Zira rose with him, stepping back to give him space. Her expression had reverted to its typical wary scrutiny, but there was something almost less hostile about it. Together they dealt with the official, tossing a small bribe to keep him quiet about their presence. Soon after, final checks were completed. The drive would hold for at least one jump, hopefully more. Dane gathered the crew, gave them instructions to prepare for immediate departure. They had little choice but to flee again, to keep moving, until the consortium gave up or was forced to fight them on unfavorable ground. When the doors finally sealed and the thrusters activated, the ship shuddered out of the hangar. Dane watched the station recede through the viewport, tension coiled in his chest again. Another narrow escape, another uncertain future. He turned away, heading back through the corridors, fully expecting to find Zira waiting for him around the next corner with a new challenge. He found her in the cargo hold, perched on a crate. She swung her legs idly, her tattoos catching the low light. She didn't look up immediately, but he knew she heard him. Clearing his throat, he approached. "We'll jump in a few minutes," he said. "Then we'll keep running," she finished. "Until we can't." He nodded, stepping closer, arms folded across his broad chest. "Is that such a bad plan?" Her eyes flicked to him. "Better than letting them catch me," she murmured. "Or you." She straightened, sliding off the crate, standing almost toe-to-toe with him. For a tense moment, they both stared, neither looking away. The hum of the ship's engines vibrated underfoot, punctuating the silence. His voice came out low. "You keep surprising me." A slow blink. "Good," she said simply. He swallowed, aware of the hammering in his chest. On the battlefield, he excelled. He knew how to predict an enemy's moves. But with her, it was all guesswork. She took a small step forward, and a flash of something ignited behind those golden eyes. He caught a faint rumble in her throat, like a purr laced with challenge. Heat rushed through him. For a split second, he fought the urge to reach out, to test the tension that crackled like static between them. But the overhead speaker interrupted, the pilot's voice announcing that they were about to jump. Zira broke eye contact first, pivoting on her heel to head for a more secure spot. He exhaled sharply, rubbed the back of his neck and followed. The corridors echoed with readiness. The hull rattled as the jump initiated. Then the nauseating lurch of hyperspace enveloped them again, and they hurtled into the unknown. He found her braced against a wall, her posture rigid. She cast him a sidelong glance, something like frustration in her features. Still prefer fighting to running, she muttered. He gave a half chuckle. We'll get our fight eventually. At that, her lips curled in a feral grin. Then I hope you won't disappoint me. The rest of the jump proved uneventful, giving the crew precious time to mend wounds and catch fragmented sleep. Dine tried to rest in his quarters, but his mind refused to settle, replaying every brush with death. Eventually, he gave up and paced the corridors, occasionally peering through the portholes at the swirling hyperspace tunnel outside. He hated the feeling of being cornered, even if hyperspace travel was a temporary sanctuary from pursuit. He found himself outside the small alcove he'd set aside for Zira. The hatch was closed. He hesitated, hand raised as if to knock, then thought better of it. She deserved space, and he wasn't sure how she'd respond to a midnight intrusion. Instead, he stepped away, continuing down the corridor in restless circles. Maybe it was the memory of her leaning over him in the bunk, or the primal sensation of fighting side by side, but he felt off-kilter, as if she were lodged under his skin in a way he couldn't define. Eventually, the freighter dropped out of hyperspace near the rim world she'd mentioned. The scanners showed minimal traffic, a few small outposts, mostly uncharted. Dane and the pilot exchanged a relieved glance. Maybe they could find a place to lie low. He made his way to Zira's alcove, hitting the door chime. She opened it almost immediately, as though she'd been waiting. Her expression was unreadable. "We're here," he said, "or close enough." She stepped out, following him, toward the bridge. They surveyed the planet on the viewports, a swirling mass of reds and browns battered by storms, ringed by debris. Sensors picked up only sparse settlements. It was barely hospitable, but for them that might be an advantage. The pilot found a stable approach vector, and the ship descended through the planet's atmosphere, buffeted by turbulent winds. The storms roared outside, lightning flashing across the hull. When they touched down near a dilapidated settlement, Dane ordered the engines to standby mode. The landscape looked harsh, rocky plains strewn with the wreckage of old starships. A few dome structures stood precariously, connected by meandering walkways that looked centuries old. But there were no obvious signs of advanced surveillance or corporate presence. He led a small party outside. The air reeked of sulfur and dust, forcing them to wear light filtration masks. Zira, apparently unbothered, walked without a mask, her feline ears swiveling to catch every gust of wind. They found a trading outpost manned by a single-board sentinel who hardly cared who came or went. Dane arranged for docking rights through a crude credit transfer, scanning the bleak surroundings for threats. Over the next few hours, they set up a makeshift camp around the freighter, deploying camouflage nets to obscure the ship from overhead scans. His men, exhausted and on edge, rotated guard shifts. Zira prowled the perimeter, occasionally returning to report on movements in the distance, though she rarely found anything beyond scavengers picking through old wrecks. Night fell quickly on the planet, painting the sky a deep, star-flecked crimson. The temperature dropped, wind howling around the jagged rocks. Dane sat near a portable heater, scanning a handheld device for any sign of inbound ships. Zira joined him, crouching at the edge of the heater's warm glow, half in shadow. Her eyes gleamed in the faint light, capturing the reflection of the flickering flames. "Your men are restless," she observed. He nodded. "They know the Rathon consortium might still hunt us." Her shoulders lifted in a slight shrug. "Then we fight when they come, or we vanish deeper into the rim." Despite the tension, he let himself meet her gaze. "Would you vanish if we parted ways here?" A pause. Then, "I could. But I'd be alone. With a bounty on my head." "That's not ideal." He considered her answer. She was a proud creature, never one to admit weakness. The fact she even entertained the idea of sticking with him said something. He set aside the device, resting his forearms on his knees. "We might be stronger together." Her lips curved in a small smile. "I suppose we might be." There in the quiet gloom, with the wind rattling the makeshift shelter, they stared each other down. His heart thumped, and he wondered if she could hear it. He wanted to ask her questions about her home, why she was so fiercely independent, who had trapped her in that cage. but he sensed she'd tear him apart if he pried. Instead, they sat in companionable silence for a few moments, letting the storm outside fill the gap. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the rugged terrain, followed by thunder that shook the rocks. The heater flickered. Zyra rose, moving closer to him. He looked up, startled, as she leaned in. For a moment, he thought she might close that distance in a way that ended all this tension. But her expression was fierce, not soft. "Dane," she said in a low murmur, "I hear something approaching." He snapped to attention, grabbing his communicator. "All hands, be on alert. Possible incoming." They scrambled out of the makeshift shelter. The wind whipped at them, and in the distance, a faint glow lit the sky. Dawn peered through his scope. Sure enough, a ship soared over the crags, lights piercing the darkness. The shape was too sleek for a simple cargo hauler. He cursed under his breath, adrenaline spiking. She slipped up beside him, eyes narrowed. "Rathon." He nodded grimly. "Bet on it." In moments, the enemy vessel landed a short distance away, silhouettes emerging from the ramp. Dane's men readied weapons, hearts pounding. The shrieking wind masked footsteps, but he could sense them fanning out, trying to encircle the camp. Zyra crouched, her body coiled like a predator preparing to strike. He felt that electric tingle of anticipation again, the pre-fight surge that reminded him he was alive. The first shot rang out, pinging off the hull of the freighter. Then, chaos erupted. Muzzle flashes lit the night. Dane and his men returned fire. Zyra darted through the darkness, using the jagged rocks as cover, pouncing on unsuspecting enemies. The storm raged overhead, bolts of lightning searing the sky. In the strobing flashes, he glimpsed her form, moving with lethal grace. He stayed, low, picking off soldiers as they advanced. The invaders clearly wanted Zyra captured, not just killed, but they had no qualms about mowing down anyone else. Dane's crew took casualties. He felt rage burn in his chest each time one of his men went down, fueling his gunfire. At one point, a swirl of dust blinded him, and he stumbled, nearly falling into a crevasse. A shot grazed his calf, pain lancing up his leg. He hissed, forcing himself to keep moving. In the haze of dust and lightning, Zyra appeared at his side, breathing hard. She was spattered with blood, her claws extended, tattoos practically shimmering with some alien energy. "We're being flanked," she said. "There's a group coming around the ridge." He nodded, adrenaline surging. "Cover. Me." They forged toward higher ground, occasionally firing back. At the ridge, half a dozen soldiers crouched behind boulders. Zyra pounced first, her lithe silhouette a blur of motion. Dane rained, covering fire, hitting one soldier square in the chest. Another soldier tried to flee, but Zyra caught him, slamming him into the rock with a sickening crunch. Lightning illuminated her face in that instant, and Dane felt a jolt at the raw fury there. Yet behind the fury was something else, a savage kind of exhilaration, maybe even joy. She was in her element. He recognized it because he felt something similar in the heat of battle. They were not so different, perhaps. The fight spread across the rocky plateau, sporadic gunfire echoing in the wind. Dane's men, though outnumbered, held their ground with grim determination. The Rathon soldiers pressed in, some trying to subdue Zyra with specialized nets or stun weapons, but she evaded them with uncanny agility. Each time they cornered her, she'd lash out in a flurry of strikes that left them scrambling or dead. Suddenly, a shrill sound cut through the storm, a heavy weapon powering up. Dane glanced around in alarm and saw a massive turret emerging from the enemy ship's belly. "Get down!" he roared, lunging to tackle a nearby crewmate. A scorching beam raked across the ground, sending up clouds of molten rock. The heat singed his hair as he ducked behind a boulder. Around him the ground split, glowing with lava-like cracks. He scanned frantically for Zyra, heart pounding. If the turret fired again, it could wipe them all out. Then, in a stroke of madness, he spotted her silhouette racing across open terrain toward the turret's flank. She pressed herself low, darting between boulders, ignoring the smaller arms fire that chipped at the ground. He realized with dismay what she intended. She was going to attack the turret at close range, an act that seemed suicidal. "Zyra!" he shouted, but the wind and gunfire swallowed his voice. Adrenaline hammered in his veins. He slammed a fresh battery into his blaster, charging after her. Another beam from the turret seared the ground, missing her by a hair's breadth. She lunged under its arc, scaling the side of the enemy ship like a cat climbing a tree. Her claws found purchase on ridges and vents. Soldiers scrambled to shoot her off, but she moved too quickly. One soldier leaned over the hull to take aim, only to have Zira pounce, dragging him screaming onto the ground below. Dane covered her from a distance, firing at those who lined up shots. Then he saw her clamber onto the turret assembly itself, yanking open a maintenance hatch. Sparks flew as she ripped at the internal wiring with her claws. The turret whined ominously, its aim jerking. Soldiers below panicked, shouting. Dine put a few of them down with well-placed shots, heart in his throat. If the turret's power core blew while she was on it. With a final furious yank, Zira tore out the main couplings. The turret sputtered, spinning uncontrollably. An ear-splitting crack resounded, and the entire apparatus exploded in a dazzling flash. She dove clear at the last possible second, plummeting off the ship's side. Dane watched in horror as she fell in a swirl of smoke. He sprinted forward, ignoring the pained protest of his wounded leg. She hit the rocky ground in a tumble, rolling to a stop. Flames danced behind her where the turret once was. He reached her, dropping to his knees, breath ragged. She lay on her side, gasping, fresh cuts and bruises darkening her emerald skin. A broken piece of metal jutted from her shoulder, blood seeping around it. "Zira!" he rasped, pressing a hand to her good shoulder. "Can you move?" She coughed, wincing, but her eyes flickered open, blazing with stubborn life. The remaining Rathon soldiers saw their prized turret destroyed and began a hasty retreat. Dine's men, emboldened, pressed the advantage, picking them off as they fled to their damaged ship. Within minutes, the enemy vessel labored into the air, belching smoke, and disappeared into the stormy sky. Whether they'd return with reinforcements, Dane couldn't say, but for now they were gone. He helped Zira to her feet, arm draped over his shoulders. She tried to brush him off, prideful even while injured, but her legs trembled, so she accepted his assistance. "You're insane," he growled, half in anger, half in gratitude. "Better than cowering," she retorted, voice strained. "Turret's offline, isn't it?" He shook his head, supporting her weight as they staggered toward the freighter. "You're going to let the medic look at that shoulder, or so help me." She gave a weak laugh, then grimaced in pain. Blood dripped down her arm. He cursed, tightening his hold, trying to keep her steady as he guided her up the ramp. The wind whipped at them, carrying the metallic tang of scorched earth. His men cheered faintly at their return, battered but alive. Inside the ship, he directed them to the medbay. The place was cramped, littered with bandages and supplies from the last fight. Zira clung to consciousness, though her eyes fluttered as the medic hurried over. Dine eased her onto a cot, carefully pulling away the torn scraps of cloth around her shoulder. Her wound looked nasty, the metal shard embedded deep. She hissed, canines bared, when the medic prodded. "This is going to hurt," the medic warned, preparing an injection to dull the pain. She tried to wave it off, but Dine caught her wrist, meeting her gaze sternly. "Let him help," he ordered. "No point being tough about it." She inhaled sharply, then relented, allowing the medic to administer the shot. Within moments, her rigid posture loosened slightly, though her golden eyes never lost their alertness. The medic began cleaning and stitching the wound. Dane stood, at her side, arms folded, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from her face. Her features were tight with pain, yet she didn't make a sound, a testament to her resilience. He saw the flicker of her pupils dilating from the medication, but she still managed to glare at him whenever he lingered too close. When the medic finished, Dane helped ease her upright, supporting her back. A bandage now covered the wound, blood staining the white gauze. He realized his own injuries hadn't been treated yet, but hers were more severe. She looked at him, an unreadable expression crossing her face. He wondered if she saw the relief in his eyes, and if it mattered. "I've had worse," she muttered, though her voice trembled slightly from lingering pain or from the sedative. He scoffed softly. "You're a terrible liar." She said nothing, leaning against the wall of the medbay, trying to steady her breathing. Despite the dire circumstances, he felt that same tension coil in the air. Perhaps it was the proximity, the adrenaline crash, or the memory of how she'd risked her life to destroy that turret. His heart drummed. The rational side of him shouted that now wasn't the time or place for whatever was flaring between them, but reason had never been. His strong suit in the midst of war. Zaira closed her eyes for a moment, as though composing herself. When she opened them again, there was a flicker of vulnerability, quickly masked. "We survived," she said quietly. He nodded, stepping back to give her space. "Yeah, but they'll come back." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She struggled to stand, but he placed a hand on her good shoulder. Not a command, but a gentle caution. She stiffened, surprised by the contact that wasn't meant to dominate or control. "Stay," he said, voice softer than he intended. "Let the meds do their job." She hesitated, then sank back down, wincing as the movement jarred her wound. He lingered, torn between the urge to demand answers about her next plan and the impulse to let her rest. In the end, he merely turned away, pushing through the curtains around the med bay to check on the rest of the crew. His thoughts whirled. This unstoppable alien was for the moment grounded by injury, reliant on him, or at least his men, for care. That dynamic shift made his gut coil with conflicting emotions. Hours later, the planet's sun rose, painting the bleak horizon in dull crimson. Dane conferred with the pilot and the remaining crew, discussing whether to move on or fortify. The battered freighter could fly, but the next jump might be risky. Rathon knew where they were now, or at least had a good guess. They needed a more permanent solution, but no consensus emerged. Sleep-deprived and battered, they had no easy answers. Eventually, he returned to the med bay to find Zaira sitting on the edge of the cot, one leg folded beneath her, the other dangling. She glanced up, eyes distant, as if lost in thought. He noticed the bandage around her shoulder was fresh, the medic's work. She rotated her arm experimentally, grimacing. "Doing better?" he asked. She gave a curt nod. "Enough to walk." He wasn't sure if that was an invitation to argue or not, so he let it stand. Gesturing for her to follow, he led her toward a quieter part of the ship, away from prying eyes until they reached a small observation port. Stars glimmered above the planet's dusty horizon, and in the distance, lightning storms rolled over the rocky plains. He leaned against the bulkhead, arms folded, letting the swirl of unanswered questions settle. "I don't know your story," he began, keeping his voice neutral, "but I can see you're not one to run forever." She stayed silent for a moment, glancing out the viewport. "You humans," she said slowly, "think everything can be solved by running or by dealing. But for me, it's always been about survival by any means necessary. It's not that I enjoy being a hunted creature. I just won't let them break me." He nodded, sensing the conviction in her words. "We might have something in common there." Her gaze shifted to him. "The vendetta you carry, I see it in your eyes." He tensed. "That's none of your business." She shrugged, wincing at the motion. "It shows in every fight, the way you attack without mercy. You're chasing a ghost or a memory, something you lost." His jaw tightened. "Everyone's lost something." A beat of silence. Then, unexpectedly, she spoke, her voice quieter. "I lost my home, my people. Now I have only my pride and my freedom. I won't let them claim either." He exhaled, tension easing a fraction. It wasn't a confession or a soft moment of vulnerability, but it was more than the curt deflections she usually offered. He let the hush linger, the distant rumble of thunder their only witness. Something in him recognized that she'd offered a piece of herself, no matter how small. Outside the ship, the storm intensified, lightning igniting the sky in brilliant flashes. He realized the crew would soon scramble to ready for departure, or for a final stand. Time felt precarious. He angled toward her, scanning the proud lines of her face. Her injuries were fresh, her posture stiff, but there was no mistaking the fierce vitality that radiated from her. "We'll figure out a way to make them back off," he said quietly, surprising even himself with the promise. "One way or another." She turned to face him fully, and the air seemed to crackle with the same electricity as the storm. "You think you can do that?" she challenged, stepping closer. Free me, free yourself from all these burdens. He swallowed, heart thudding. I can try. She lifted her hand, claws retracted, brushing it lightly against his chest in a gesture that could have been a taunt or something more. He felt the warmth of her skin through his shirt, an unsettling, galvanizing sensation. Every nerve in his body lit up with a mixture of confusion and desire. She studied his reaction as though testing his limits. The moment stretched taut like a bowstring on the verge of snapping. Then an urgent call rang out from the comm. "Dine, we've picked up a spike in the atmosphere. Could be a scout. We need you on the bridge." He pulled back, tension fracturing. She withdrew her hand, that purr of hers resonating softly in her throat, unreadable. "Duty calls," she said, her voice tinged with something that might have been disappointment or relief. He nodded curtly, heading down the corridor at a brisk pace. She followed, steps silent behind him. The next crisis loomed, but so did the next chance for them to fight side by side, to prove that their alliance was more than just convenience. Though neither would say it, the attraction swirling between them had become an undercurrent, too strong to dismiss, woven into every glance, every breath they shared. It was a fuse lit, slowly burning, waiting for the inevitable spark to ignite it completely. They reached the bridge to find the pilot and a few crew scanning sensor readings. A faint blip indicated a small craft in the upper atmosphere, too. Far to confirm identity, but suspicious enough. Dane cursed. The Rathon scouts wouldn't give them much time. They needed a plan, whether that meant taking the fight directly to the consortium or vanishing into uncharted space once and for all. "Warm up the engines," he ordered. "We might need to break orbit fast." He felt Zyra's gaze at his back. Closing his eyes for a beat, he wrestled with the conflicting urges roiling in him. Fight, flight, or something more complicated. When the moment to choose finally arrived, he'd see if they were both willing to commit to the same path, or if their colliding drives would tear them apart. As the pilot scrambled to comply, the freighter hummed to life, engines throbbing in the hull. Crew members rushed to stations, stowing gear, preparing for another possible confrontation. Outside, lightning danced across the sky, an echo of the tension simmering within the ship. Dane positioned himself near the main console, scanning the readouts. The unidentified craft hovered at the edge of sensor range, likely relaying their position to a larger strike force. Zyra approached, placing a careful hand on the console. He glanced at her and she nodded, expression grim. "Let's not wait for them to come," she said, her voice carrying that familiar undercurrent of challenge. "We could set a trap." His brow furrowed. "A trap?" She pointed to the readout of the planet's terrain. "We know they'll send down more troops. What if we choose the battlefield? Lure them to a place where we have the advantage. Wipe them out before the rest arrive." He considered her plan. She was right that waiting around made them targets. "You're still injured," he reminded her. "You can barely lift that arm." She bared her teeth in a sharp smile. "I can lift enough to kill them." Despite himself, he felt a tug of admiration. He glanced around, noticing some of his men listening in. "Fine," he said. "We'll need to move fast. If we can cripple another of their landing parties, maybe they'll think twice about chasing us further." He detailed a quick strategy. They'd take a small, nimble shuttle from the freighter, flying low across the planet's surface to a narrow canyon not far away. There, they'd set mines and booby traps. When the enemy scouts reported their location, the next wave would likely land in that canyon, expecting an easy capture. Then the ambush would spring. It was risky, but everything they did nowadays was. Within half an hour, Dane, Zyra, and a handful of hand-picked crew launched from the freighter in a battered shuttle, hugging the planet's rocky terrain to avoid detection. The ride was bumpy, the storms thrashing them. Zyra clutched a support, rail wincing occasionally at her shoulder, but never complaining. They touched down in the canyon, wind swirling dust around them. The crew disembarked, swiftly placing mines and sabotage devices at strategic points. Zyra climbed onto a ledge overlooking the canyon floor, ignoring her pain, scanning the skies like a hawk. Dane positioned men behind boulders, forming a crossfire zone. If Rathon's ships descended, they'd find themselves in a kill box. Tense minutes dragged by, the storm overhead intensifying. Dust devils whipped through the canyon, forcing them to shield their faces. Dine hunkered down near a rock outcropping, checking a remote detonator. His heart thumped in anticipation. This plan relied on the scout ship leading a landing party, directly to them, and on them not bringing overwhelming force. It was a gamble. Then Zira's low voice crackled over the comm. "They're coming." He peered upward and saw the telltale glow of engines descending through the swirling clouds. The craft was smaller than the one they'd faced earlier, but it bristled with weapons. As it neared the canyon floor, its searchlight swept over the rocky walls. The whine of landing thrusters echoed off the cliffs, and Dane motioned for his men to hold their positions. Zira crouched on her ledge, invisible against the dark rock, her eyes reflecting the craft's lights. The enemy ship touched down amid swirling dust. Troops spilled out, forming a perimeter. Over the comm, Dane heard one of them shout, "Scan the area, the target must be close by." Another demanded, "Set up a dampening field. We don't want her slipping away." Dane recognized the glimpses of advanced gear. This was no ragtag band. The consortium had sent an elite squad. His stomach churned with tension, but it was too late to back out. He waited, fingers on the detonator, until the soldiers were well within the canyon. One signal to his men and they unleashed a burst of gunfire from multiple angles, bullets ricocheting off rocks. Zira sprang from her perch, landing among them with a snarl, claws slashing. Chaos exploded. The soldiers returned fire, their rifles spitting plasma bolts. Rocks shattered under the intense barrage. Dane and his men kept to cover, picking targets. He triggered the first set of mines. The canyon floor erupted in flame, and debris throwing some soldiers off their feet. A thick cloud of dust enveloped the area, reducing visibility to a few meters. Shadows danced in the swirling haze. Dane advanced carefully, scanning for movement. Through the dust he saw the green flash of Zira's body, caught in strobing muzzle flashes. She was unstoppable, flipping and weaving through gunfire. Even injured, she fought with that savage, fluid grace. Despite the heavy sedation earlier, she seemed fueled by adrenaline now, ignoring pain. A soldier lunged out of the dust at Dane, swinging a plasma baton. Dane blocked with his forearm, wincing at the jolt of energy, then drove his elbow into the soldier's face. Another assailant fired a volley of shots that tore through Dane's coat. He ducked behind a boulder, returning fire. The second wave of mines detonated, shaking the canyon. Screams and shouts mixed with the roar of the storm. The air tasted like gunpowder and blood. Dane spotted the squad's commanding officer near the ship, barking orders. They were trying to scramble back aboard. He signaled a crewman to focus. Fire on the ship's engines. If they disabled it, the squad would be stranded. The man nodded, firing an RPG-like device that slammed into the craft's hull, causing it to shudder. Zira, battered and panting, emerged from the dust cloud. Her eyes glowed in the flickering light, wild with battle lust. She nodded at Dane, then jerked her chin toward the commander. "He's mine," she growled. She didn't wait for permission, charging forward with reckless abandon. Dane cursed and followed, not wanting her to face them alone. The commander saw her coming, leveling a high-powered rifle. 2 shots whizzed by, kicking up chunks of stone. She zigzagged, ignoring the strain in her injured shoulder. One more shot grazed her thigh, drawing greenish blood. Dan fired at the commander, forcing him to duck. Zira seized the chance, closing the distance. In a blur of motion, she knocked the rifle aside, delivering a punishing blow with her uninjured arm. The commander stumbled, but whipped out a sidearm. She twisted, disarming him with a hiss of pain. Blood streamed from her reopened shoulder wound, but her expression was pure fury. Dane arrived at her side just as she sank her claws into the commander's chestplate, ripping it loose. The man gasped, eyes wide with terror. "Stop!" he pleaded, hands raised. "We can negotiate." She bared her teeth. "Negotiate!" "This," she snarled, raising her claws. Dane caught her wrist mid-strike. She snapped her gaze at him, pupils dilated in rage. He shook his head once, panting. "We need prisoners to interrogate." For a tense second, it seemed she might defy him. Then, with a frustrated growl, she wrenched free, cuffing the commander hard across the jaw. He went limp. Dine nodded, grateful she hadn't torn him to pieces. "Tie him," he ordered a nearby crewman. "We'll get answers." The rest of the enemy force lay scattered, dead or fleeing into the storm. A few survivors limped back toward the battered ship, which spat sparks from the ruined engine. They were in no condition to continue fighting. Dain's men swarmed in, securing the area. Casualties on his side were minimal this time, thanks to the ambush. He couldn't deny a surge of grim satisfaction at having outplayed the consortium's best. Amid the swirling dust and flickering fires, Zira stood trembling, one arm wrapped around her injured shoulder. Her face was pale beneath the emerald hue, streaked with soot and blood. Dain approached her, heart hammering from adrenaline and concern. "You're hurt," he said, a statement more than a question. She tried to hide her pain behind a defiant stare. "I'm fine," she snapped, though her voice faltered. "We won." He let out a shaky breath, stepping closer. "Yeah, we did." He reached out as if to steady her, and she didn't pull away this time, though she stiffened at first contact. Their gazes locked, the dust-laden wind tearing at their hair, the storm raging overhead. Something raw burned in that moment, a culmination of fear, fury, and something dangerously close to desire. Her breathing was ragged, matching his own. Blood trickled from the reopened wound on her shoulder, and he could see her gritting her teeth to remain upright. For a split second, he considered an easy, reassuring gesture, maybe a hand on her cheek or a comforting murmur. But that wasn't who they were. Instead, they stood there in the wreckage of a battle, hearts pounding, each waiting for the other to break the silence. Then she lunged, and for a heartbeat, he thought it was another attack. But instead, her lips crashed onto his in a fierce, unexpected kiss, a clash of heat and violence that mirrored their struggle. He froze, his mind blanking under the assault of sensation. The dust, the blood, the storm, they all faded to a distant roar. All that remained was the press of her mouth, the taste of copper and adrenaline, and the searing tension that had finally ignited. He responded without thinking, arms coming up around her, ignoring her flinch of pain. Their lips parted briefly, a gasp of breath, then collided again, rough and claiming. It was not gentle, not soft, more a primal affirmation that they were alive, unstoppable. Her nails grazed his back, and he couldn't contain a low groan. Every nerve thrummed with intensity, pushing aside the last shards of caution. The kiss ended as abruptly as it began. She jerked back, eyes wide, chest heaving. He stared at her, equally stunned, a rush of conflicting emotions swirling in his head. Guilt battled with triumph, confusion with undeniable longing. She pressed her hand to her bleeding shoulder, breathing ragged. He tried to speak, but no words came. She coughed, turning her face away, as if embarrassed by her own impulsive act. "Don't think this changes anything," she hissed, voice unsteady. He found his voice rough with unspent adrenaline. "I wouldn't dare." They stood there, battered, exhausted, and intimately aware that a line had been crossed. The men around them worked to secure the area, collect the wounded, and salvage gear from the enemy's wrecked ship. None paid much attention to the two, figures locked in a silent standoff of raw attraction. The storm raged on, lightning illuminating them in staccato bursts. Finally, he gestured toward the waiting shuttle, clearing his throat. "We need to get you patched up again." He tried to keep his tone neutral, but he couldn't hide the tremor in his voice. She nodded wordlessly, allowing him to guide her. This time there was no pretense of pulling away when he supported her. They limped through the settling dust, both aware that something monumental had shifted between them. It wasn't surrender. There was no sense of submission in that kiss. It was more a collision of equals, an acknowledgement that the tension between them had become undeniable. They flew back to the freighter in tense silence, the wounded commander in tow. The medic scrambled to address Zira's reopened wound. She winced through the procedure, casting occasional glances at Dain, who hovered nearby. He refused to leave, feeling oddly protective, though he doubted she needed him fussing. She caught him watching, and he saw a flicker of vulnerability, before her eyes hardened again. "Don't," she said in a low voice, pushing the medic's hands away after the stitching was done. "I'm fine." Dain sighed. "I know you are." He forced himself to give her space. The rest of the crew glided around them, stowing. weapons and discussing the next move. No one dared comment on the moment in the canyon, but some had surely witnessed it. He felt the unspoken curiosity in their eyes. He retreated to the corridor, trying to gather his thoughts. Memories of that violent, fervent kiss replayed in his mind, each time sending a jolt of heat through him. He pressed a hand to his forehead. This was madness. They were still in mortal danger, and the rathon threat hadn't gone away. But how could he deny the raw inevitability that pulsed between them? She emerged a few minutes later, bandaged anew, looking exhausted, yet still defiant. Her gaze locked on him immediately, as though drawn by an invisible tether. He squared his shoulders, half expecting an outburst. Instead, she stepped closer, voice low. This, whatever it is, it doesn't change the mission. He nodded, meeting her intense stare. Agreed. But the tension in the air belied their words. They both knew something had shifted irreversibly. When the pilot announced they were lifting off again to relocate, the two of them moved toward the bridge. Side by side, neither spoke much. What could they say? Apologies were meaningless and denials rang hollow. The ship roared off the planet's surface, punching through swirling storm clouds until they broke into the upper atmosphere. Dane scanned the sensors, half expecting more enemy ships lying in wait, but there was nothing on the immediate scope. Perhaps the battered survivors of the last assault had retreated to lick their wounds. That gave them a window, small but precious, to escape again. The pilot angled the freighter away from the planet. Crew members scurried to their posts. Dane turned to find Zira leaning against a console, eyes half-lidded with fatigue. He crossed the deck in a few strides, placing a hand gently on the rail beside her. She looked up, and for once she didn't pull away from his proximity. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "You've done enough." She gave a weary smirk. "Done enough fighting or done enough kissing?" His face heated, and he was thankful the dull lighting concealed it. "Both," he answered just as quietly, "at least for now." She pushed off the console, swaying slightly before regaining her balance. "I'll think about it," she said, brushing past him. He watched her walk away, his pulse still hammering. They had reached the breaking point, that precarious line between animosity and desire. The future felt more uncertain than ever, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Soon, the freighter made another jump, engines straining. They hurtled through hyperspace once more, forging deeper into the rim. Dane collapsed into the captain's seat, the pilot ceding control to autopilot. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion gnawing at him, images of the battle swirling in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured her face in that final moment. Before their lips met, fierce and unyielding. One of his men approached, murmuring a status update. Things were stable for the moment, no immediate threats on the scopes. Dane nodded and dismissed him. Rising, he limped to the corridor mind. Already drifting to Zira's alcove, he told himself he just wanted to ensure she was okay, that her wounds weren't reopened again. But he knew there was more to it. When he reached her door, he hesitated for a long moment, then tapped it lightly. No response. He tapped again, a bit louder. Still nothing. Concerned, he overrode the lock with a security code, stepping inside. She wasn't on the cot. Confusion knotted his brow. Then he noticed a faint draft from the ventilation panel. It was ajar, just wide enough for someone of her lithe build to slip through. He cursed under his breath, stepping back into the hallway. Where had she gone now? The ship's ventilation shafts spanned multiple decks. She might be anywhere. Another wave of exhaustion threatened to crush him. Did she not trust him enough to stay put even after everything? Resigned, he closed the panel, figuring she needed her space. Whatever they had, this alliance, attraction, or madness couldn't be forced. He returned to his own quarters, wincing at the ache in his leg, and collapsed onto the bunk. For a moment, the memory of her pressed to him in that fervent kiss flared again, stirring heat in his blood. Then weariness washed over him and he surrendered to sleep. In the hours that followed, the ship drifted through hyperspace, battered and scarred. Some of the crew dozed, while others kept watch for any sign of a chasing fleet. The flickering overhead lights cast a perpetual twilight. Eventually Dane stirred, roused by his communicator buzzing. The pilot reported a possible safe harbor. Ahead, an abandoned mining facility on an asteroid belt known to harbor smugglers. He rose, scrubbing the sleep from his eyes. His side felt stiff, the bullet bruise flaring, but he ignored it. On the way to the bridge, he nearly stumbled into Zyra in a narrow passage. She appeared out of nowhere, expression calm, though shadows of fatigue lingered beneath her eyes. Without a word, she fell into step beside him, as if they'd planned to meet. Reaching the bridge, they stood together, surveying the star map. The pilot pointed to a cluster of asteroids in a remote system. If they navigated carefully, they could hide in the debris and land at the old mining facility. The possibility of salvage and new supplies, maybe even a place to regroup, was tempting. Dane agreed, and the pilot made the necessary course adjustments. Azira leaned on the console, her gaze flicking to Dane. "If it's abandoned, that means no law, right?" He gave a short laugh. "Perfect for us." A note of camaraderie lurked under his gruff tone. She smirked, acknowledging his point. The swirling tunnel of hyperspace loomed ahead in the viewport, and in that moment, Dane felt a rare optimism. Perhaps they would find respite, enough to plan their next move against Rathon, or to find permanent freedom. But as they dropped out of hyperspace in the asteroid belt, sensor alarms blared. The pilot cursed, scanning the readouts. Multiple contacts. Dane's heart sank. It seemed they weren't the only ones who'd thought of using this place as a haven. An entire squadron of small fighters circled the largest asteroid, their transponders scrambled. Zira tensed beside him, a low growl echoing in her throat. He steadied himself. One more fight or one more negotiation beckoned. Regardless, she was with him. They both faced the uncertain horizon of battles yet to come. But somehow, with her at his side, claws, fury, and that consuming spark of passion, he found the resolve to keep going. If the world insisted on threatening them at every turn, then they would survive it together. She slid him a sidelong glance, reading his expression, and he returned it, the ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. Tension still burned between them, now mingled with a strange sense of unity. No matter what storm lay ahead, they'd face it as allies, maybe even as something more. And as the ship pressed deeper into the asteroid field, weaving between tumbling rocks and potential hostiles, Dane allowed himself a rare flicker of hope that this chaotic dance with Zira could lead them somewhere neither had ever dared to dream. A place of hard-won peace forged by blood, fire, and undeniable desire. The final confrontation would come. Rathon would not relent. Their bond would be tested beyond measure. But when the dust settled, their fate, whatever it might be, would be decided not by corporations or vendettas, but by the battle-scorched tie that now bound them. For once in his life, Dane refused to stand alone, and as he felt the heat of Zira's presence at his shoulder, he knew she felt the same. They had chosen each other in the furnace of conflict, and whatever came next, they would see it through to the very end. They braced for impact. The fighters darted closer. Zira's claws flexed, Dane's grin sharpened. Together they prepared for that final decisive stand, and whatever lay on the other side of it they would face as one.